Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the third installment of York Circle at Home lecture series for the 2021-2022 academic year. This year's theme is titled, "O Canada, the True North Strong and Free?" A historical journey through Canada's transgressions of individual and community rights. Excuse me. Today's lecture topic is cycles of inequality and exploitation in nation building. We have a fantastic panel of speakers today as we cap off Black History Month with this York Circle event. My name is Julie Lafford, and I'm the Executive Director for Alumni Engagement for York University. It's now my responsibility to acknowledge the land I'm on, and because this event is virtual, we're not all gathered in the same space. So please take the responsibility to acknowledge the land that you are currently on. The website native-land.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located, which precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake regions. I'd be remiss not to mention the devastating attacks on Ukraine that began earlier this week. Many of our community members, including our students and alumni, are from or have ties to the Ukraine. Our thoughts are with them, their families, and loved ones during this truly terrible time. Before we begin today's presentation, I do want to give you a quick university update. A few weeks ago, York released a dynamic new report documenting our progress towards the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs. The UN SDG report is York's first annual progress report on the SDGs, and both the report and the accompanying website highlight York's leadership, commitment, and progress towards the 17 goals through inspirational stories, facts, and figures, and forward-looking action. I think you'll find it inspiring to see all the actions being taken towards creating positive change, and I encourage you to take a look at the website too. It's yorku.ca/UNSDGs, and that website should be coming up in the chat for you as well. If at any time this morning you need help with today's experience or you have questions about the content, please click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team in the background is ready to help. As always, the presentation will be also recorded and uploaded to our YouTube page for you to share with friends and family. The same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speakers to answer during the Q&A section later this morning. As many questions as time permits will be posed to our panelists. All of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. I now have a quick poll for you. Today's question is, how would you rate your current knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? So that poll should appear on your screen right now. Please take a moment to respond. Thank you for your participation. It's helpful for us and our speakers to have an idea of who's in our audience and the knowledge you each have and bring to today's topic. Now I'm happy to introduce the chair and host of this series, Dr. Rebecca Pillai Riddell, Associate Vice President, Research and Academic Chair of York Circle. Dr. Pillai Riddell is a professor in the Faculty of Health. She's a pediatric pain researcher and clinical psychologist at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. She's an acclaimed researcher. She leads the OUCH Lab, which stands for Opportunities to Understand Childhood Hurt, where she seeks to reduce pain in child health. Welcome, Dr. Rebecca. Welcome, Dr. Pillai Riddell. It's a pleasure to have, as always, to have you leading our discussion. So I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the third session in this year's York Circle at Home lecture series. As Julie mentioned, my name is Dr. Rebecca Pillai Riddell, and I'm the academic chair of the York Circle lecture series. As many of you know, this series capitalizes on the diverse strengths of York researchers, from policymakers to molecular scientists, to engage you, our audience, in the intersections of ideas against specific topics. And this year is in the context of Canada's history. I'm honored to help bring together multidisciplinary panelists to dissect and discuss 4 themes relating to our overarching topic over 4 sessions throughout the current academic year. This series is co-hosted with our organized research units, and today's series, our panel, we are joined with academics from the Harriet Tubman Institute. For those of you unfamiliar with the Harriet Tubman Institute, the Institute is committed to the study of the past, and it is linked to the present experiences of Africans and its diasporas from multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives. Thus, the Institute's research program brings to light the diversity of Africans and its diasporas, and the importance of diversity and understanding that diversity of Blackness and what Blackness means in the Canadian context. I'd like to take the time to acknowledge and thank Director Gertrude Nyanda and Deputy Director Danielle Elliott for helping me to bring together today's panelists for the third topic in our series, which is entitled Cycles of Inequality and Exploitation in Nation Building. Our first presentation, led by PhD student Yvonne Simpson, invites reflection on Canada's historical reliance on transnational color-coded systems of labor force selection, while maintaining a system of exclusion and accounting for those who experience disproportionate levels of injuries and disabilities. Many questions will be explored in her talk today, including how do we learn about who bears the burdens of harms in the nation's workplaces? Next, Professor Sylvia Bawa's presentation will ask us to reflect on the question, in what ways are we implicated in the global economic and political arrangements that produce inequality, displacements, and dire poverty for others, as well as other important questions? And finally, Professor Celia Romulou presentation aims to start a conversation on the ways in which race and gender offer specific perspectives to investigate power in the production of memory and history in a globalized world, and more specifically in a Canadian context. I'm so excited that Yvonne, Sylvia, and Celia could join us today. I know you will learn much from their presentations. And now I will introduce our first speaker, Yvonne Simpson. Yvonne Simpson is currently working towards a PhD at York University and has a strong history in teaching, research, and consulting. She offers leadership expertise in disability support services, activation of knowledge transfer in the delivery of personnel training for enhanced deployment of programs, and services within the public and private sector organizations. Simpson is a well-rounded learner-centric educator with a track record in utilizing legislative mandates to support effective policies and practices for managing inclusion, equity, and diversity in academic and classroom settings and the workplace. Welcome, Yvonne Simpson.
Thank you for your welcome, Professor Riddell, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So to begin, in the spirit of reflecting on history, especially in context of Black History Month, I invite consideration of this history as part of the nation's official history. A natural question which flows from this thought process is, why is it important to consider the nation's history and our sense of belonging in the nation's story? Perhaps this context can best be described by what Alan Gordon wrote when he said, memory, commemoration, and public history, he said, it's best as a starting point. A nation's members live not only at the same time, but in the same time. Not only at the same time, but in the same time. And I would add to his sentiments by saying, we also live in the same place connected by this history. According to Gordon, they also live, meaning us, the nation's people, also live in communion with the past. Nations picture their history as part of the community and imagine their identity within. This sense of identity and belonging, while paved with overwhelming sources of achievements and pride and joy, which is quintessentially what Black History Month celebrates. It is also paved with this sense of tension. And in the context of this morning's thematic discussion, this progress moves within a cycle of inequality and exploitation as well. And it is linked to a foundational history that is perpetuated to our present lived experiences. And depending on where you're socially located, you may be affected in a different way. But I characterize some of this history as a history that resides as a source of deep pain and unhealing wounds. I will share with you why I believe that is the case. In essence, Black History Month draws us together to consider the complicated vestiges of history and its linkages to the present and how we may shape the future going forward, how we may imagine identity and belonging in the nation's story. And at the same time, with the knowledge that we gain, try to figure out how we may disrupt some of these cycles of inequities. Perhaps a good thing to start with to consider for us is this question. And I'd like you to record this question as sort of as a mental note-taking and a response that you have to this question. What is the engine that keeps the nation operating and growing? Okay, record your thought about that. And well, based on my research, which focuses on disability occurrences and counting and accounting for occupational health and safety in the nation's, among the nation's racialized immigrant workers, these workers are not identified by their demographic identity in our national sources of tracking occupational health and safety. For example, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board's published data on workplace injuries and fatalities does not provide for demographically identifying information beyond age and gender, linking to industries and where injuries occur. And this prompts another question. How do we learn about what is happening with respect to health and safety and the nation's workers? Do we all have the same experiences in terms of workplace health and safety? Now, let's consider the current pandemic that we're in. And I'd like to add my research predates the pandemic. So these were thoughts and ideas that I was exploring before we were struck by this awful pandemic. The stark reality that we've learned from the pandemic is that racialized workers are disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19. However, we don't have statistical confirmation of who and how many and where are they and in what occupations. We do not have a fulsome version of the facts. But rather than my commenting or speculating and generalizing about these questions, let me contextualize this question in another way of considering this. So based on the reporting of Stats Canada, we know that what they have said, Stats Canada that is, Canada's population is projected to be made up of immigrants and second generation individuals, that is non-immigrants with at least one parent born abroad by 2036. And starting in 2031, more than 80% of the nation's growth is projected to come from immigration. Now let's compare this to what was said earlier in earlier statistics. In 2011, that was 67% of the nation's growth. So we can see there's an upcline in this representation of immigrant workers, majority of whom are coming from countries considered to be predominantly racialized populations. I propose that injury and disability in Canada's workplaces is an area where we can begin to address sources of inequities, thereby sending a signal that health matters. Black people's health matter. And it just is a situation where we need to begin to not only account or be accountable, but count the disproportionality of the injuries and the disabilities so we can have evidence-based data of this. And for us broadly as a community, as a nation, we must ask the question about health and well-being and disability occurrences as an outcome of workplace participation, and perhaps reflect this question: how do we or don't we care about this issue? Do we care? Do we need to know? Do we have a sense of wanting to know about the folks who are upholding the growth of the nation? Where do they sit in terms of their health and safety in the nation's story? We really don't know very much, although we know 80% of the nation's growth will be on their shoulders. Let us consider the current status. Where is Canada positioned on the selection of immigrant workers? Let us take, for example, one example among the categories of workers. Let's consider the farm workers who are selected based on race, based on their countries of origin. Mexico and the Caribbean is where Canada has continuously maintained a contractual arrangement of recruiting these workers. And you may know that since the inception of the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program in 1966, which started with a pilot project between Jamaica and Canada, and to this day, the same workers' contractual arrangements have maintained itself. If we want to know how a seasonal farm worker, now considered an essential worker, may be injured or lose his or her life on one of Canada's farms, where might we look for this information? Can we possibly disseminate this information from our occupational health and safety systems? The answer, my friends, clearly no. Currently, the demographically identifying information of workers remains undistinguished, unidentified, invisible, and perhaps not even thought about while we have our meals that are created and grown on Canada's farms. Now, if we were to compare and look across our border, the labor statistics in the United States, and we're looking for what is happening to our Canadian workers in the United States, we can see immediately how many workers were injured who are Canadians, how many workers may have lost their lives who are Canadians. We cannot say the same for our workers here in Canada. And furthermore, the system of leveraging services and supports and prevention to effectively launch interventions to prevent injuries. We cannot do that because we don't know. So this means this invisibility perpetuates and contributes to the cycle of inequity, and it goes unseen, unnoticed. Let us recall this bilateral agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean, specifically targeting racialized workers. It is not a pleasant story, but it is part of our history. The perpetuation of inequities and exploitation continues through these cycles, through these policies that we have all become a part of. I should add, once in Canada, temporary farm workers are bound to that employer for which they were recruited for the work that they're doing. If they leave that employer or become ill so that they cannot work, the best ticket that they will get is a ticket back home. It is not a ticket for care. Let me help you out. So let us look at how identity has played out. What do we know about the history of Canadian workers, African Canadian workers in this larger tapestry and in the nation's history with respect to work? How does it compare from our historical past to our current day? Have you considered how Black racialized immigrant workers were accounted for in the nation's occupational systems back then? And how is it similar to now? Despite our ongoing quest to disseminate and unearth this history, we still know very little about workplaces, and who's being injured and who is bearing the burden, but we have some ideas. Historians like Cooper, Whitfield, and Winks, among others, have for decades now informed us about the contributions of African Canadians in the nation's history. But we do not know because they don't uptake the story of occupational health and safety in the nation's workplaces. This is where my research begins. And so I link this to the system of disability occurrences and the significant gaps of accounting for occupational health and safety. And the intent of purposing this discussion is to say, if we know that 80% of the nation's productivity will be reliant on these workers, and we know that they're coming from racialized countries predominantly, why then are we not inserting this same tracking in our occupational health and safety systems? We have a need to know. At a minimal level, one would expect in the occupational health and safety informatics sources that we would be using the public purse in a very meaningful and strategic way. Because if we don't have the data, if we don't have the information, how do we then target our prevention strategies? Let us consider what the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board does. They will capture age, gender, younger workers, older workers, the industry, the body parts, but we will never know what type of worker, where, and from whence they came. But we know we're recruiting them and we know who they are. So let us consider for a moment the state of lack of accountability, the lack of accountability, that is where we are now. Why do you suppose it would be important to know about occupational health and safety in the nation's workplaces for racialized immigrant workers? And quite apart from undertaking this inquiry as a dissertation topic, I would add, within the scope of our socio-political environment now, where are we currently in understanding the situation concerning these workers? And what about the historical legacy? Let's take up a walk through this historical legacy. Let's think about some of this information. I'd like to share an exhibit with you, and hopefully I can bring this up now. I am going to share my screen and share with you some interesting information about our history. Let's look at this. If we want to know about our history, I will share some of how we've come to this pathway, linking our past to our future. Let's consider, for example, our first known historical account of workers in Canada. This is on my screen. If you are sighted and are able to see this, I'll describe it briefly. It's a typed outline of the census, first census taken in Canada by the first intendant. We see the reflection of 401 servants in Canada. Who might they be? And how are they grouped together like this? We had a history of not saying anything about race or race in our history of census capturing. The intendant of France, when he took the survey, went about the small village under King Louis's ordinances to take an account of who was in the village. In his handwritten document capturing the census, the intendant, John Tallion, went about and noted household to household. What is missing? Indigenous people. There were no Indigenous people noted in his survey, yet we know Indigenous peoples have been on this land since time immemorial. Let us consider the regulation of Black bodies, though, 400 or so servants. The Code Noir tells us, because King Louis also had laws regulating the entire Caribbean where he had territories, of how Black bodies should be regulated. In the Code Noir, and I would argue, this is probably our first policy talking about the health and safety of the enslaved workers. Ordinances were granted that if a worker was unable to work, they would be taken to the Hotel Dieu, that was developed by the nuns at the time, for care. We don't know what happened to those workers or if anyone made it there. We would have to ask the nuns and look at those records. Finally, when I look for our nation's history and what happened to the workers, remember that survey I showed you at the start, the census? Here we have an example of a person who ran away from enslavement in Quebec. And this is a poster from 1777. We have more demographic data on a poster of an enslaved worker who ran away than we do today in our occupational health and safety system. We know based on this poster that Joe was bilingual, that at the time he escaped from the Gaul, and this was his third escape, that Joe was born in Africa. He was 26 years of age. He was about 5 feet 7 inches. He had smallpox and he had scars and injuries on his legs. What we know is that since history and since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples have been excluded, Black African people have been excluded and only gained attention once they attempted to seek their freedom. Finally, I know I'm at my mark now, Professor Riddell, I will sum up by saying this. On our final poster, as we walk the streets today, we might come across the streets, Peter Street or Russell Street. Do these streets ring a bell? They're named after one of our first administrators for Toronto. On this poster, and at this pivotal time in February, Peter Russell posted this poster seeking to sell his enslaved person, Peggy, who had attempted to escape many times. For punishment, he strung Peggy's son up in a store. And at that time, of course, Peggy would no longer seek to leave because she wanted to safeguard her son. Out of the injuries, the traumas, and what has happened to our workers, we have an attestment to Peter Russell, 2 streets, and a poster naming Peggy as someone he sought to sell. As we walk the streets in Black History Month, and we walk on Peter Street and Russell Street, let us remember Peggy and how we have been excluded, but there's a monument to this history that we must now connect and look for greater visibility and awareness of Canada's injured racialized workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne, for a thought-provoking conversation from past to present and the cycles and repetitive perpetuation of inequity, particularly in occupational health. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce to you is Dr. Sylvia Bawa. Dr. Bawa is a global sociologist whose research links globalization, human rights, and post-colonial feminism with developmental theory. With a specific focus on women's rights and empowerment in sub-Saharan Africa, Dr. Bawa's work examines the ways in which historical forces and events shape current political, economic, cultural, and social circumstances, whilst highlighting the particular cultural and social circumstances, while highlighting the particular contradictory and paradoxical outcomes they produce at national, global, and local levels. Professor Bawa, thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Riddell, for the introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm glad that I could join this conversation. And going after Yvonne's talk, I'm going to continue on the theme of various discussions around who is present, who is absent, especially when we think about ourselves and when we think about our lives. I like to start with a story. Now, a tale is told of a flood in the animal kingdom. The monkeys were quite unaffected by the flood as they sat up atop the trees. They looked down and noticed that a lot of their compatriots were affected very badly by the floods. So they then devised a rescue mission and strategy. And that mission was that they would go down simply, lift up all the other animals that were affected by the floods onto dry ground. So in carrying out their strategy, they went down from their treetops and lifted all the fishes that were submerged in the water and placed them all on dry ground. They went back up to their treetops, satisfied obviously with their fantastic job they thought they had done. Now the fishes started to wriggle, and the monkey said, "Oh, see how happy they are to have been saved from this flood." Obviously, after a few minutes, if minutes at all, or seconds, the fishes lay motionless, dead. Now the monkeys said among themselves, "Wow, how ungrateful are these fishes? They couldn't even say thank you before taking their naps." I'd like you to hold on to that story as I continue with the rest of this presentation. As you heard from the introduction, earlier introduction, my conversation today is to ask us to think about the ways in which we are connected to various people, various societies, various nations far away from us. And I'd like you to do an exercise. I started with the story, and now I'd like you to do an exercise. And with this exercise, what I want you to do is that I want you to look around you or think about the resources that you use on a daily basis, on a regular basis, perhaps even the device that you're using to connect to this York Circle event today. What is that device? Where is that device made from? Where was it made from? What is it made of? Who transported it? If you had a cup of tea or coffee, perhaps you might want to think about where that coffee came from, how it got onto your shelves and into your fridge today. Yvonne was just talking about farm workers in Canada, and I'll touch a little bit more on that. But I'd just like you to think about all of the things that enable your life on a daily and a regular basis. How is that made possible for you? For instance, sometimes it is amazing for me to go into a grocery store when we are not in a particular season of a particular fruit and find that fruit. Do we think about where these kinds of things come from? So yes, I'm leaving you with a lot of questions. I'm going to talk to you today about globalization and how our lives are interconnected with people who are far away from us. Our lives are indeed made possible by the labor of others, by the resources of other places that are geographically far away from us. And more than any other time in our history today, we depend on transnational circulation of goods, of technology, of ideas, and services to live, and indeed of farm workers crossing the borders to work on our farms today. And while we always use, globalization as a term to describe these increasing interconnections, and we talk about living in a global village, it is important to think about what that village is. Who is in that village? Who do we see in that village? Or who does not come to mind, even when we are talking about that particular global village? For instance, without traveling outside of one's locale, you can still access all these goods. You don't need to go anywhere. You just need to go to the nearest store to access these kinds of goods and services. One thing that we must never forget is that this process, however, is unequal. It's not neutral, right? The system that we have today is built on a certain history, and it is that history that connects us. It is that history, for instance, that enables us to be communicating in English, perhaps, and not in Dagari, which is my own mother tongue from Ghana. And so in these kinds of connections, we are implicated one way or the other by a history that we probably were not a part of, likely were not a part of constructing, and nevertheless have been forced to live. Powerful nations of the world today, as they did several hundreds of years ago, influence and dominate the economic, the political, the social, and the cultural landscapes of various less powerful nations in the world. Now, if you've been living in the global north, and since this is a diverse audience, some of you are still living in the global south, or some people are connecting from the global south. But if you live in the global north, for instance, if you live in Canada, you no less have come across various advertisements on television asking you to donate various amounts of monies to save people, to help people who are living in dire poverty elsewhere, say, for instance, in global south countries. In most of these advertisements, you are presented with a picture, a really sad picture of people who are not able to afford the basic necessities. One of my favorite ones, and I say that sarcastically, is the one that says that you can donate the amount of money you spend on your coffee a day, which is $1 or even less than $1, to save or help some poor children in some other faraway place in the world. Of course, we are moved by pity as human beings. We are moved by what we see, the images especially that are presented to us, to act. Most often in acting, we also then fail to ask certain critical questions. How did it come to be that these people are now in such dire straits, for instance? Were they always in dire straits? Did they always need this kind of support? And what is our role? What is the role of this country, for instance, Canada, in perpetuating this inequality, establishing this inequality, for instance, or in helping to solve this inequality? Does this kind of solution, or do the solutions that people are offering, do they respect the dignity of the people in those places? Have they considered all of the historical issues that led to that particular situation. And yes, like I said, I am here to ask questions so that we can deliberate on these together and with friends and family later. Now, knowledge plays a central role in our perceptions and in our interactions and in our assessment of others far away from us. If I were to ask you simply what you think about African women or third world women, very generally speaking, I might hear various stories, including the ones that you get if you Google the image of third world women. If you've never done that, just Google, do a Google search. And you see a very particular and stereotypical image that is presented over and over again. Now, those things contribute to the ways in which we think about, the ways in which we imagine these other societies. And because of this kind of global inequality, which is premised a lot on the history of colonization, non-Western societies are always placed as, or are always seen, pictured as these places that need to be saved by the Western, by their Western counterparts. And this has resulted in marginalization, not just of the people, but of knowledges that are produced from those places. It's also distorted the representation of the way in which inequality works. In other words, it is not just that it was a draw of luck. It is not just that people who live in Canada just tend to work harder, that they were just, if I may use the Christian term, that they were just blessed with resources. It distorts this kind of representation. The other thing is that it does not enable us to ask critical questions, to ask questions which I've asked you to ask before. So charitable interventions, as per the story that I told earlier on, are sometimes then designed with a particular image in mind, not necessarily with the consultation of people and not necessarily with considering all of the historical factors in place. These charitable interventions, as we've seen from time and again, tend to focus on individuals, right? It is this idea that if you save this one child in the village somewhere, that if you buy a goat, that if you submit your $1 a day, you're doing all of these things. On the one hand, you're saving the one individual. On the other hand, on this side of the border or on this side of the globe, you are the one individual. One of the questions that I ask people to consider is, what happens when you lose your job, for instance, when you can no longer contribute your quota to saving that other person? Does that person's life also end or stop because you're not able to support? Part of this issue is that we then take on larger structural issues on our own as individuals. We become these one-time saviors for people when we should be considering how we should restructure our economy, how we should restructure our politics, our engagement with countries, with structures away from us. So let me give you some examples or food for thought in relation to some of these questions. Many of you, no doubt, many of us use cell phones. They've become the lifeblood, especially in these days. And almost all of our cell phones, if not all of them, would contain a key ingredient, which is known as cobalt. Now, this key ingredient is mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, under very questionable circumstances. And this often includes child labor, for instance. Now, the DRC is also one of the richest pieces of land on earth because of its abundant diamond reserves. And again, if you speak about diamonds, many people know about diamonds. Diamonds are forever, right? And yet it is also one of the most economically impoverished countries in the world. Now you think about it for a second. You think about how for one place that contains diamond, that contains cobalt, that enables our life, that encourages or enables the culture of people, getting married, buying diamond jewelry at very exorbitant prices. also becomes one of the most impoverished places in the world. And so if you are asked, for instance, to contribute $1 a day towards the survival of a child in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as an example, you might want to ask yourself, are we doing this the right way? Is this how we should go about dealing with and solving the structural inequality that does exist in the world? I'll give you my last example, and that example is the COVID-19 example. I'm glad that Yvonne touched on it as because it connects so many things. We notice that, if we are looking at COVID-19, it is something that has touched everybody in the world. And yet very quickly, when we had vaccines developed, we are quickly on the stage of boosting people in many countries in the global north. And yet, very few people in the global south have received at least even one dose of the vaccine. And if we are to believe the mantra that this pandemic does not end for anyone unless it ends for everyone, then what are we doing wrong? Where is our solidarity? And this is where I want to leave the conversation. How do we think about our ethical responsibilities towards those others who are far away from us? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bawa, for a very thought-provoking conversation about the relationships of economies in the global north and the global south. Now I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Dr. Celia Romulou. Dr. Romulou is an assistant professor in the Department of International Studies at Glendon College. Her research and teaching draws from anti-oppression and anti-racist education, Afro and decolonial feminisms, and explores questions related to the gender and the politics of memory, migrations, citizenship, political violence, and interdisciplinary methods. Prior to completing her PhD, Dr. Romulou worked as a program director in the areas of gender-based violence in public spaces and in security sector reform for UN Women, the United Nations entity dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women. She continues to work as a consultant and trainer on questions related to anti-oppression, anti-racism, Black femininities and masculinities, gender mainstreaming in public policies, and in development. Welcome, Professor. Please take it away.
Thank you for this introduction. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to share a couple of thoughts. You will see that my remarks are, I would say, connected to both presentations you've heard. So I will start by sharing my screen. Here we go. Okay, so today I want to share a couple of remarks on how we can try to engage with the politics of memory in Canada, and basically try to engage with colonial past, which is actually still anchored in the present. And in order to do so, I want to give you a little bit of context. The remarks are based on observations or findings coming from, I would say, two pillars or sets of ideas. The first pillar being fieldwork carried out in Haiti and Montreal, exploring the intergenerational of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti, which lasted from 1957 to 1986. And that, I would say, exploring the memory of that dictatorship was done through co-constructing life stories with men and women, Haitian women, men and women who were displaced due to political violence. The same groups of people moved to Montreal and then organized, I would say, to resist systemic racism in that new context. The second pillar is more so based on work on pedagogy and higher education, acknowledging on one hand, this, I would say, slowly changing demographics in the classroom, efforts deployed to decolonize and internationalize curricula in social sciences, that have resulted in increased attention to equity in the teaching of global politics. But also, I would say, acknowledging, on the other hand, that current conditions in terms of academic research, publishing, and teaching continue to put women and racialized faculty at a disadvantage. And the existing obstacles remain understudied, particularly when it gets to people who challenge discursive and intellectual hierarchies through an engaged classroom. So based on these observations, and my remarks are meant to be an entry point to explore the politics surrounding the collective remembrance of the past and their impact. In this framework, we understand the politics of memory to mean political processes of dealing with political violence. In other words, dealing with formative, but also often traumatic collective experiences that are part, I would say, of the nation's history and identity. I'm hoping that our reflection during the Q&R can tap into contemporary debates about memory policy making, but also the mobility and the construction of memories across a number of boundaries. So we can think about borders, we can think about generations, but also discursive boundaries. And examples I think are particularly relevant to our conversation today range from the management of monuments with the recent toppling of statues, but also the media coverage, or sometimes lack thereof, of racialized experiences. So oscillating between the erasure, but also the over visibility of certain issues, depending of what it is that we're dealing with. So more specifically in the Canadian context, which has already been addressed by Yvonne Simpson, where we can think about genocide, slavery, segregation, and other types of racialized and gendered violences, engendering both, I would say, racial trauma and inequities, as I would say highlighted by Yvonne Simpson and Professor Bawa, and how they are collectively remembered. So in order to guide us in this conversation, I want to highlight insights from the Colonial Scholarship and the Colonial Scholarship and practices that are anchored in experiences and knowledges of Indigenous and Afro-descendant women. Knowing that that type of scholarship, but also practices aim to decenter Eurocentric and other hegemonic systems of knowledge in global politics. It's an argument in favor of memory work and experiential knowledge so as to promote critical thinking and also independent learning. So the question that I want to ask is related to collective memory. And so we can refer or understand collective memory as a shared pool of memory, knowledge, information that is shared by a social group. And that is significant in terms of like how the group identifies, or group identity. The concept comes from sociologist Maurice Halbach's and like dates from the mid-19th century. So the important thing to keep in mind is that collective memory is a social construct, is a political construct, and it can be shared and passed on or transmitted by larger or smaller social groups like nations, generations, communities, so on and so forth. When it gets to I would say the topics that we're talking about, which are like events of political violence, it's important to understand that this specific type of the memory that is linked to that specific type of violence becomes a strategic resource for specific groups. So memorial representations become a site of struggle, if you will. We can think about it as a site on which like different types of narratives will be placed in competition, if you will. So in order to highlight the importance of stories, I want to use Dina Georges's words, and she tells us that stories give us access to the deeply human qualities of how political histories get written, from the existential experience of trauma, loss, difficulty, and relationality. So that is to say, or to reiterate the importance of building collective memory coming from lived experiences on one hand, but also mainly lived experiences and narratives. I would say build on these experiences and narratives that come from the margin. In order to do so, when it gets to memory and also I would say historical narratives, it's important to understand that silences are part of those narratives. So the questions that we want to ask ourselves is like, what's the role of silence in the production of memory, in the production of history? And so we need to understand that individual and collective silences are always intertwined and constitutive of complex and fluid memorial processes that will shape the ways in which we understand events as individual and as communities. So the ways in which we will remember and forget. In order for us to, I would say, keep thinking about or sitting with these questions, I find that some theoretical insights are useful to think about the questions that Yvonne Simpson and also Professor Bawa already raised. So how do we think about identity and belonging when it gets to nation building and the narratives that we mobilize in nation building, but also how do we connect the local to the global? And how do we find narratives that help us disrupt inequities or systems that continuously build inequities locally and globally. So some insights that are useful, in my opinion, come from decolonial feminist authors and activists, referring specifically to Caribbean and Latin American decolonial feminists today, such as Espinosa Miñoso or Curiel. And they remind us that one of the central concepts developed by decolonial scholars is the concept of coloniality, which allows us to understand the continuity of colonial forms of domination after the end of colonial administrations. And that continuity is partially built on epistemic violence. So the production and dissemination of Eurocentric narratives and other hegemonic narratives. Again, I will refer to Professor Bawa's presentation. It is also a question most of the time of trying to understand who's present and who's absent, and what kind of power structures narratives reinforce or question. To that effect, I think it's important to think about works around epistemologies of ignorance and silences in history. So I'm referring to Michel Roth-Trouillot and also to Anna and Sullivan. And according to them, when we refer to epistemologies of ignorance, we're talking about the examination of the complex phenomena of ignorance, which has as its aim identifying different forms of ignorance, how they are produced, sustained, and what role they actually play in knowledge practices. So I would say two insights to me are critical. On one hand, they tell us that ignorance is sometimes the result of some kind of epistemic limitation. But on the other hand, ignorance can be structural. So it can be built, sustained. So it can also be cultivated by actors who have power and an interest in maintaining others in situation of subordination. So in that sense, we can also understand it as, I would say, some kind of constitutive mechanism of how our societies function and produce knowledge. So for us, being in an academic setting, it's always something very important to keep in mind when we think about how we learn, what we know, and what we don't know, and why it is that way. Which brings me to memory and history. And Trouillot explains that any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences. So it's a result of a unique process. And the operation that is required to deconstruct it or deconstruct these silences will vary accordingly. So it's always contextual. He also tells us that power enters the story at different points. So it doesn't enter the story once and for all. but at different times and from different angles. So it precedes the narrative proper, but also contributes to its creation and its interpretation. Also in the process of deconstructing these silences, and because it is contextual, it's interesting to look into, I would say, the insights that are brought by Black scholars of Black geography, and notably in Canada, people scholars such as Catherine McKittrick, Denis Mugabo, who remind us that Black resistance in Canada basically is always a project of space making and remaking, one that actually seeks to create relationships that are radically different, and that seek to question, challenge, and eradicate what McKittrick calls the seductive and comfortable geographies of domination and ownership. So when we link, I would say, the insights from those Black geographers and that decolonial scholarship, I think that, like, from my perspective, two main ideas are interesting to highlight, seeing the conversation that we're having today. The first one is that it is interesting to keep thinking of Black diasporic communities as continually reconstructed through people's movements across borders, and thus as like concomitant, like I would say, movements of practices, creation, intellectual production, and political praxis, as well as lived experiences. And on the other hand, to think of the importance of recentering race and the ways in which we think about global governance, but also the ways in which the global impacts the local and vice versa. And so I'm again referring to Professor Bawa, but also scholars like Robbie Chilliam, Yolande Buka, Olivier Ruta-Zibwa, so on and so forth. So connecting lived experiences to contexts and structures allow us to understand the ways in which systems of oppression impact specific groups, how these systems are intertwined with settler colonialism, and finally, how knowledge production and modes of remembrance can perpetuate the status quo or help us to conceive of other ways of interacting and being. So I will just conclude by maybe highlighting some of the key ideas that are put forward by these like decolonial thinkers, that like a decolonial feminism requires epistemic disobedience, so which most of the time will involve unearthing marginalized narratives, notably coming from Black and Indigenous women. It's also developing a praxis that is anchored in and reflects lived experiences. And third, it's I would say a political project. So it involves emancipatory projects tackling mutually reinforcing systems of domination like sexism, racism, and capitalism. And yes, thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and discussing these very important topics with you.
Thank you, Professor. So now at this point, I will ask all of our speakers to turn their cameras on and their microphones for the Q&A and panel discussion. And to the audience, I would invite members in our audience to submit any questions that they may have for our speakers. If you're watching this on Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose your questions. We'll be welcoming some members of our audience to ask their submitted questions live to our panel members. So keep an eye on your Q&A button for a prompt and instructions for our team. And for those of us who are joining us on Facebook, please submit your questions using the comment box for this video. Okay, so I'll ask some of our audience to please, we'll give them a moment. And I'll start the questions off, actually, if I take that opportunity while people are typing in some questions. The question I have for each of the panelists to start is, we've talked about these cycles of inequity. And in each of your different areas, you've talked about how and really clearly articulated these cycles and how they keep perpetuating, if we're talking about economies, definitions, even through migrations, and, things like that. What would you say could be one of the most powerful things across each of your areas of expertise to break the cycle? So whether, there's been talk about restructuring economies or restructuring definitions, I'm curious, as we review the past and the present and look to the future, do you have what would be one of the most powerful suggestions that you could make about breaking the cycles? And I'll plant that there. And if anybody is ready to speak first, I'll leave it at that.
Yvonne, will you go in? I can start.
Go ahead, Professor Bawa.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a really important question. And there are a number of things. Off the top of my head, the one thing that I can think about in terms of breaking this cycle really is to do it through knowledge and alternative knowledges, right? It is also to ask that people reflect on what they know. And I think across all the three presentations, this is one of the things that we've touched on is, what knowledge do we have? How do we know? And what knowledges are kept from us? How is this knowledge curated for us? So I think it's really important for us to hear alternative stories, alternative voices. But for me, most importantly, is to humanize others, right? That is probably one of the most basic things you can do, is to think about others as having similar dreams, ideals, knowledge, enlightenment, all of those things that you ascribe to yourself. Think about others as carrying on dreams and aspirations and things like that, and wanting a fantastic life as you want. And I think that is the starting point for solidarity. It is also the starting point for you to begin to ask questions about how it is that you see others very differently. And of course, the moment you see and construct other people as others that are not you, that are less than you, then of course, mistreatment, marginalization, just continues. And this is exactly how it started during the colonial processes. It is the same way that it started. It is the dehumanization of others, but it's not, it doesn't start grand with dehumanization, quote unquote, right? It starts with the little things where, you see others as other, less than you or not you, right? So I think that I'll leave it then. Let Celia and Yvonne contribute some more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely, to add to what Professor Bawa has said, because I focus on history and the workplace, I would say, if we're thinking about change and we're in an academic institution right now, that reflection begins with self. So in the context of history and what we know and don't know, we should be asking ourselves, in this history of our nation, what is it that I don't know about the people who have been here, who came later on? And in the context of work, where did they work? What did happen to them? Very basic things. So if my education in the academic environment isn't telling me about this, why is that? And so in that self-reflection, we can become active in terms of making this inquiry on an individual level. Then we build this to a crescendo of many people wanting to know, and then demanding of our institutions that the history or the story of the nation should be part of our story. And then we can begin to learn about the other, or the people who have been put to the side, marginalized, and not included in the official story or the official history. Secondly, in terms of the workplace, all of us here, and perhaps those in the audience, we work, or we may know someone who works. So it invites, what is happening to our workplaces? Who is there and who's absent, and what happened to them? And how do I learn about them in our official sources of data or information? So it all starts with a place of self-reflection if we want to make systemic changes. Then on a more broader scale, as citizens, we can then join our voices and say, in policy and in practices, why is it that our laws are such that if someone comes here to work over centuries, and in particular with our migrant workers since 1966, why are they permanently temporary? Should we not have a say in how we want equity to be seen in our laws so that people are no longer non-citizens shipped home if they become injured or hurt. We have a voice in that.
Thank
That's
you.
how we need to change.
Thank you, Yvonne. Professor Rebecca?
I'll just say a few words because I think that Professor Bawa and Yvonne Simpson like really echoed like what my thoughts were on the question. I think that like I find that the distinction like between like what might be an epistemic project and a political project is useful, but knowing that the epistemic project is part of the political project. So like Professor Bawa was saying, we need to actually question knowledge production, and I would say the political economy of knowledge. So how those knowledges are produced and what kind of systems they contribute to on one hand, and on the other hand, to reinforce like Yvonne Simpson's like point, we also need to keep in mind that like there are like policies in place and like institutions in place, and the way that these institutions function also reinforce those systems. So we need, it's kind of like an approach that will be tackling all of these issues at the same time, which is extremely challenging. But like I guess like that's the way, that's the only way, and that like what we have to work towards.
Thank you. The first question coming from the audience, and I believe this would be for you, Professor Wamilu. What part do individuals play in the transmission and creation of collective memories? But if anybody wants to, but I feel that maybe we'll start with you. Sorry.
Right. It's a great question. Thank you. As I was saying before, like when we're looking at modes of remembrance, memorialization, and the politics of memory in general, we're always talking about mechanisms that like are happening at different levels, micro and macro. So we're looking at like how individuals are remembered, but also how collectives remember. And the truth is that like, and it's also an interdisciplinary approach. But the truth is that like in terms of the way we remember as a collective, is that like those like individuals and collective memories are always intertwined and will shape one another, right? So in terms of the roles that we can play as individuals, and I'm still circling back to what was said before, it's really like, you know, practicing that reflexivity, I would say, and looking inward and like trying to figure out like, what is it, how is it that I know what I know? So it's kind of like, you know, practices that are linked to what we call critical thinking in universities at the moment, although sometimes we have a hard time defining what it is that we mean by critical thinking. But it is questioning, I would say, the modes of like knowledge production, the sources, but also the impact, the targeted audience, and so ultimately what those discourses, because like memory, and when we're talking about memory and history, we're talking about discourses and narratives. So what it is that they produce, and as individuals, we can do that, right? And also seek those alternative like narratives, so diversify our sources and the places in which we actually seek information.
Thank you. Professor Bawa, Yvonne, do you have any thoughts on this particular topic?
Yeah, I would add to draw us back to one specific example from my presentation. If we can think of how we can implant this as an example of memory and making that memory part of our lived understanding. I go back to Peter Street. How many of us, and many of us may have been on that street and never for a moment thought about who is this Peter Russell and what role did he play in our history? If we were to examine that and link Peter Russell to Peggy, I'm wondering if that street could also have a little something written below about Peggy, because right now, if we don't invoke Peggy's memory out of this postering, we would never know any connection to our history and the relationship and how we're linked to this history as well, because there's a lived memorization of Peter Russell, but nothing about Peggy, who labored and worked and worked and worked right here in the city of Toronto, to the point where we have this poster of her and her efforts to seek her freedom, but there's nothing postering her history, although we have Peter. So let's think about how we need to connect these histories and ask the questions. And I think that's where we need to go. Continue to ask the questions and make something happen out of those responses.
Yeah, sorry. And I would just very quickly go on that point of connection. I think for me as a sociologist, this is one of the best ways to do it, is to connect all of the dots. You know, you wake up in the morning and you have coffee, you have tea, you know, wow, I have tea. And it's actually, it can be a very interesting project to engage. You know, I just ordered a Mac and it arrived 2 days ago. Wow, you know, they weren't just delivered by drones, right? There were people working in that factory. Who are those people that are working in, you know, in those kinds of factories? Who is it that makes it, you know, possible for me to be alive in the morning when I have my coffee, for those people who need coffee to be alive, right? And I think the moment we begin to make those, they may be subtle, they may be small here and there, it immediately forces us to break those silences. It immediately forces us to think about those people that are easily marginalized, that we don't see in our classrooms now. Well, now many of us are not in classrooms or not in our places of work, but you know, when we do go back, hopefully at some point, you know, we go into classrooms, we go into places of work that are cleaned for us. We know all the administrators, we know, you know, who the provost is, we know everyone, but we don't know the janitors. We don't know them by name. We don't say hello to them. They don't address us in town halls. Why is that? Right? And those are some of the things that, you know, we have to begin to make those kinds of connections. I just walked into this place, my life is made possible. So I think for me, it is connecting those dots that help us. And it's not such a difficult task, for instance. It starts small, but then gradually you see the whole picture.
Almost like pulling back the curtain to think deeper as to how, you know, your life has been enabled at every stage. I think as a child psychologist, we always, I try and always think about that for my kids as well, to be better adults, is to actually to understand that just at an individual basis, that if you drop garbage or you don't put a chair away, or who is going to do that? And so applying that to history as well, like who's left out of the story, I think it's fascinating. We do have a couple of questions have come through, and we've kind of combined them because they're on a similar topic. And so the questions are about, actually, we talked about the classroom, or Professor Bawa talked about the classroom, but how do we dismantle the systems of oppression within the post-secondary institution? So actually kind of turning the lens on the academy. Does anybody want to start with how we can dismantle the systems of oppression within, make things better within the academy?
Celia, go ahead.
Well, I think, okay, that's obviously a great question because it's a challenging one. So, and again, so those are questions that like we can, I guess, like spend a lot of time sitting with, and I think there's a lot of trial and error involved, and that's the way to go. But for me, I think it's always useful to remember where our universities come from and what are those legacies, and knowing that, like, especially where we are located, we're talking about colonial universities, and like that's the root, I would say, of those institutions that we're referring to. So I think it's always important, and that also helps us to maybe think about dismantling, I would say, systems of oppression and domination. Again, as I said, as a political project that touches upon like all of the areas that are part of our society at the moment, and that it's like, it has to be that way. So referring, for instance, to Indigenous scholars like Tokin Yang, and they insist on reminding us that like decolonization is not a metaphor, right? So that we can't use that term just to refer to everything and anything that relates to anti-oppression education, for instance, right? So that unless that type of education or knowledge production is linked to the repatriation, I would say, of, as they say, of indigenous ways of living, knowing, but also land, that we're not talking about decolonization per se. So I think that to me, it's important to keep that in mind, because like there are a lot of things that we're doing inside the institution. So I think it's important to keep those political projects in mind, to actually make sure that we're not kind of like depoliticizing these issues. So they need to be connected to practices, as Professor Bawa was just saying. They need to be connected to how we try to impact, I would say, the local but global economy. We try to impact policies. We try to impact like the ways like our societies are organized. So I don't know if that's helpful, but to me, it's just like, it's a lot of questions, and it has to be a lot of questions at all times, or else we're just doing oftentimes like work that is like performative, but we're not actually touching to the root causes of like what produces inequities, including in our institutions.
Thank you. Professor Bawa.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that aspect of decolonization into the frame, Celia, especially when we talk about our indigenous societies, our indigenous communities. And if at the beginning of, no, well, it wasn't the beginning, it was in May 2021, when the mass graves of various children were discovered in this country. And I know that that did shock the conscience of many people, but not of the people who had been saying that this had happened. You know, we simply refused to listen, in part because, again, we attributed humanity, or people attributed humanity to a certain group of people and not to the others, because people were saying, how is it possible that people could have been that inhumane? But we've seen it, we saw it, you know, throughout genocides in the world, we've seen it through enslavement. So when we talk about, for me, when, you know, how do we dismantle these systems? I saw a skit, and I do not remember who the comedian was, who went to a theater, and after they did the land acknowledgement, they were about to start, you know, whatever play they were doing, and the person asks us, so are we going to donate proceeds from this performance to the people whose land we are on? And, you know, the answer was no. So we just carry on, right? So what does it mean for us to do land acknowledgements for us? Since we're at York University, let's turn the camera on York University. When we do those land acknowledgements, and, you know, what does it mean? Have we actually even ensured equity for the people whose land we occupy, you know, from where we are making money, profits, and all of those things? At the very least, do we have a compulsory university course that teaches people about these people whose land we occupy, right? And we just didn't occupy this land, you know, it was a very traumatic experience that led to the occupation. And I'm saying we, because it is collective in a lot of ways, right? What does it mean, especially when we say we are decolonizing knowledge, and yet in our university systems, in our in the academy, the people that we reference all the time when we talk about anything continue to be one group of people, mostly male European white males, right? What does it mean that we do not have a curricula that actually reflects you know, the indigenous people whose land we are on? And the reason we're talking about this is that if, you know, and because I do globalization, if we're even going to talk about the people who are now far away, say in Ukraine or the DRC, that we don't even see, if we don't start with the people that we live with, who are very much invisible in our everyday practice, in our everyday teaching, in our everyday everything that we do, and how do we even reach beyond them, right? Like, how do we not start local? Anyway, so that is something that I think it's really important. The other thing that I think we should really also emphasize that, you know, in addition to Celia, your point about asking questions, and that's really crucial at every stage when we've done this, now what, all of those kinds of questions. It's also that thing of political will. Really, what will it take to break these silences, these comfortable silences that we continue to hold? Like we say we want to hold, you know, systems accountable, but how are we doing it? Let's really ask ourselves. We've become really comfortable sometimes, especially within the academy, in externalizing our activism. right? Because it's, oh, you know, some other people will go on the street and we can just sit down and sign petitions. But what would it take? Why is there no more action in a space or in these spaces of the academy that are supposedly some of the freest spaces anyone can, you know, can ask for, right? So what is holding us back? So yes, I'm asking Celia's question again, you know, what is really holding us back? There's a certain level of comfort that we need to disrupt. And we need to implicate ourselves in the ongoing cycles of oppressions, you know, the silences that are ongoing. And I just like to end that with, you know, this, since we're talking about decolonizing knowledge, an indigenous African philosophy of Ubuntu, right? Which means I am because we are, and you are because we all are, right? In other words, our humanities are interconnected, and we see it. So many people, race scholars have written about this. If others are suffering, we are not necessarily enjoying life. And we know this, you know, people talk about guilt all the time. You know, what do we do with this guilt that we now carry? And people try to assuage this guilt, you know, but we need big systemic changes. And for me, it is that we really need to all be feeling bad on a regular and daily basis that these, you know, systems of inequality continue today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yvonne, did you want to add anything for the next question?
No, just one quick thing. It starts very much at that individual inquiry. So today in the academy, if a professor is saying, I'm looking at my course outline and there's a lot of interest now in EDI, and if I'm taking personal responsibility to try to decolonize my course outline or the curriculum, what can I do and where do I go? So if you ask that question and you don't have any idea where you could go for help in your institution, or you have no idea where to begin, then a good place to start is to look at the systems that you interact with to inform you on changing your curriculum, changing your course outline, and go to that system and say, I need help with this. Are you prepared to help me? If there's no help, we know someone needs to be accountable and a change needs to happen. So that transaction of attempting to make change is very concrete and it's very real. And if you are undertaking an action and the system, the academic system isn't responsive, this is where I really drill down on this point about counting and being accountable. We need to be finding out and we need to be reporting, this is a problem for me, I need this to change. And if we continue to build on that, this is what forces the change. It begins with the question, why is it this way? I need it to change. Who's responsible? Who's accountable, and what systems? And this is, we need to move towards this change in a very concrete way by asking these introspective questions in the academy.
Thank you. Our next question will actually be live from Philistina McLeod. Philistina, may I ask for you to unmute your microphone and ask your question to our panelists?
All right. Okay. So I agree with a lot of what has been I'm hearing, to be honest, because my background is also in sociology at a graduate of York University. So I'm always glad to participate in anything York has to offer. But my question is, I've heard so many of these topics of discussion before, and it doesn't lead to anywhere. How do I know what is missing from after everything is said and done and everybody go on their merry way? How do I know what the changes that we can actually get involved in afterwards? Because I've heard it before. And they're well approachable topics of discussion. I'm not disputing that. They're powerful. But I just want to know, how can we take this and move forward and be empowered to actually apply it, to make, Anyone can answer. I'm not going to pick on my sister from Glendon, but
Who would like to start?
Sylvia, I don't know if you were going to start. Okay. So I'll very quickly say thank you very much for the question. And I think you express the frustration that we all face, right? Because again, we speak about this, we talk about this, and it's been ongoing for a very long time. You know, if we just take the history that Yvonne gave us, it's been over 400 years, you know, of enslavement, and we are still here. Nevertheless, also as a sociologist and as one who is always the perpetual optimist, we've made certain changes. It's not always, you know, it's not at the scale at which that it should be, especially given all that we've endured. But there are changes that are occurring, and it sometimes it's gradual. So for me, in terms of your question, in terms of, you know, there are so many things to join, so many actions, so many movements, and all of those things. For me, it is starting with conversations sometimes, just very simple conversations, or interrupting conversations, for instance, you know. So somebody comes to your door and says, you know, we are donating money to African women. You ask these questions. How much of that money is actually going to be in the hands of those African women? How much of that money is for the budget of your executive directors who are probably sitting in Ottawa, sitting in London, France? You know, how much of that budget goes to a PR campaign where you're taking thousands of pictures? But more importantly, you know, so ask those kinds of questions to these people. And yes, you just meet them, and every now and again, you know, I go to the mall and then I end up spending hours, because when I meet someone like that, then I want to have a conversation, you know, because then I think that, you know, sometimes we also take it for granted that people know things. And so you've asked this question, and you're right in saying some of us do know, but it will surprise you at how many more people really just don't know. And this is, I think this is also one of the problems with, you know, knowledge production within the academy, is that at a certain level, we know everything, right? Like we've researched these things, but at the policy level, what is really happening there? And I'll give you a quick example and I'll hand over. Recently, 2016, Justin Trudeau's government, the Liberal government, decided to implement what they call the Feminist International Foreign Assistance Program, right? And because this is my work, this is my area of expertise, I've been following this. And what they are interested in is that they want to make foreign aid feminist as a starting point. So how are they doing this? So they start with things like, you know, innovative women's empowerment projects. And I go to read the language of that innovation. And that innovation basically says that for you to apply for this grant, you must have implemented a similar grant of up to $5 million or something like that in the previous, you know, in your history as an organization. Clearly, what is happening is that the bigger transnational NGOs are going to get this grant and work with the grassroots organizations. And so what is happening is that, again, this same thing of knowledge transmission, right? This same thing of top-down approach with the story I gave earlier on of, you know, people jumping down and lifting people, and actually making the situation worse happens. So the question that I would have asked, or the question that and you can write to your MPs as an action. This is one of the nice things about a country that does not repress us politically. You can write to your MPs. What are you really doing? Have you considered this alternative view? The question that I would ask is, where is Canada in terms of fair trading? Canada has transnational mining corporations in various countries in Africa and in Latin America that are committing egregious human rights violations, destroying the environment and the societies of various places that they are. And of course, they are contributing to the wealth of Canada as a whole, right? Where can we ask them those kinds of questions, right? And so for me, it is that engagement. And you are right, we hear about it, but I think gradually we make some moves. Hopefully someone listening may become, the executive director of Oxfam and may say, okay, well, let's really think this through. So instead of going over and rushing over to African women to help, let's all rush over to Ottawa and say, what are you doing? stop cheating people, engage in fairer trade. And if you were to actually do that, no one would need charity, right? So I think the gaze, we need to turn the gaze right back on here in terms of, like where are we looking elsewhere? Let's look at our parliament. Let's ask those questions to our elected representatives.
Thank you. Yvonne.
Thank you, Professor Bawa. I'd like to say this quickly, that you asked a very concrete question, and I'd like to concretize some of the things I talk about conceptually. So in occupational health and safety, if I were to apply your question, nothing changes. I came to this research in my PhD journey because it is something that when I was working in disability support services, I noticed the people who were the users of the service and how I could not learn any information about statistics or occurrences or frequencies of injuries to racialized immigrant workers or diverse linguistic workers who were experiencing, from what my lens showed me, a disproportionate amount. It was just flooding into me, and I could not find anything in our nation's data system, Workplace Safety and Insurance Board data, to inform me about this phenomenon. That's where my inquiry started. So one of the responses is, if something isn't changing, who do I need to speak to, or who do I need to contact with my concerns? We have voices. So one of the concrete actions is to use our voice to go to our legislators. I learned that the Occupational Health and Safety Act directs what is captured in our informatics sources about occupational health and safety. I learned from speaking to key informants across Canada why the act did not reflect a need to capture demographic data. I learned that this is why it's not happening. I was so curious. Then I said to myself, the act needs to change. There is an identifying of something concrete that needs to change so that we can account for and begin to know more in an evidence-based way how people are being affected, which people, where, what are the sorts of injuries, how is this happening? And we have no idea. So a concrete change, and how we make that change is to demand a change in occupational health and safety policy so that we can say to our governing bodies, and it's a provincially regulated act, it goes across the country, every province has an occupational health and safety act. So now I hope to, and if funding permits, and if I get to that journey, to continue the conversation with experts across the country to say, how do we now come together and change this act? Because it's no longer appropriate to say, well, we just have to comply with the act. If the act perpetuates inequalities, if the act excludes, if the act bears hidden experiences of people's injuries, it must go. And we, the people, need to raise up and make these demands. It's when we're quiet that nothing changes. It's when we accept that the status quo is okay. But when we have knowledge through these conversations, which is why we need to love York and bringing people together and being part of a discussion and being part of a conversation to identify the problems. And you've asked a great question, nothing changes. So how can we change it? Let's join our voices and look at what needs to change and make that demand, because I plan to continue my journey. I plan to say, I need funding so that I can go across Canada and talk to the experts in policymaking and have a panel on how do we change the law so that we begin to account for workers' injuries, and then the public can be informed, know what's happening, and then take other actions. That's how we can do it.
Thank you, Yvonne. Professor O'Meara?
I'll just say quickly that, like, thank you for the question, and I'm happy to see my blend of people here. Just like quick comment to say that, like, I understand the frustration. I feel the exact same way most of the time, and so it's always great, rich and stimulating to be part of these conversations. And at the same time, I guess that like we're always like kind of like worried that the institutions like do not go beyond the conversations, notably when they mobilize, I would say, racialized faculty, educators and staff, but do not necessarily translate and change when it gets to, like Yvonne Simpson was saying, in terms of like numbers, resources, representation, so on and so forth. So I'm 100% in agreement. But yeah, to me, like, it's just like saying that, like, I think that, you know, like we have to assess, like, you know, what the potential sanctions are, because institutions do not react very well to change most of the time. But that being said, that like doing small is also fine, and it's like it's incremental most of the time. So like starting conversations with 2 people, 3 people actually works, in the sense that the next time around, like you have more folks, but you have also learned from like that like very small initiative that you started. And also for me, in terms of it also means like working outside of the academia, and like making sure that all the areas of work and engagement are always linked. So like working within and with communities is linked to teaching in the classroom, and that like it informs like the teaching and research and so on and so forth. So it means also producing knowledge in a different way. So it means like talking back to the institution too. So questioning that knowledge production, but also saying, okay, like there are different ways to do that when you can, because like it's not always feasible. So I know it's not the best response, but I'd say let's talk. Let's keep in touch and talk. That's how we do it.
You know, it's so important in these feelings of frustration to also diversify the leadership itself. Not just being outside of the leadership and asking for policy changes, but being the change itself and being a part of those systems as well, and diversifying. Without the diversification of leadership and things like that. So absolutely. Our next question will be live. Zoe M., would you like to ask your question live to the panelists?
Sure. Thank you, all of you, for all of your work. It's so important, and I'm learning a lot, but you're more, I guess, solidifying what I'm learning. So you've all kind of touched on my question, but my question is from the outside in. I'm curious what conversations, what questions are other countries who are sending their citizens here asking of our government, demanding of our government? When we ship you our citizens and they're returned and they're injured, what happened? Why aren't you able to tell me? What goes on when we release and sign visas that, you know, our citizens are coming to you? And I'm curious if you know, like, what is happening with conversations with countries that we continue to take people from. And I'm sure, you know, Yvonne, I know you touched on Mexico, for example, in the Caribbean. These countries must be asking, especially if we're returning their citizens, and taxing their healthcare systems with injuries or things that have happened in our country. So I would love to hear more there. Thank you.
Zoe, thank you so much for that question, because I too was very much triggered, you know, as I began this journey of the research, and especially where immigrant farm workers are concerned, what actually happened, some of the narratives of their lived experiences. So here's the issue, and how the historical colonization continues to impact today. I said in my presentation that nations such as Mexico, Jamaica, and the Caribbean islands that are part of these bilateral agreements, they have not changed 1 inch since 1966. Our nations in the Caribbean, Mexico, are complicit in these agreements. It is, in fact, an agreement that if you become injured and you can't work, you go home. The nation has agreed to this. So we have to begin to understand, why is it that the Caribbean leadership is in agreement with policies that fall all intent and purposes will say, if you can't work again, you're shipped home. And you may not ever return if you cause major problems with work arrangements. If you try to run away and work for another company, or if you're breach your immigration contract and you try to leave and work illegally, if you're captured by immigration authorities, that's it, you're sent home. We need to understand that there's a term in critical theory that is called complicity. Complicity operates on so many institutional level, whether we're talking about how curriculums are unveiled in the classroom or this law of immigration and workers. So what are governments saying about it? Because of the nature of impoverishment and the economic circumstances that the history of enslavement, the history of colonization, the history of economic policies between the North and the South, this is why these systems are perpetuated. So we need to maybe look at the larger globalization entity that Professor Bawa has talked about, and how workers continue to be trapped in this ongoing system of exploitation, because where do you get work? That's how forced migration happens. You have to leave and take any contract you can to get work to support your family. Why do the leaders continue to maintain policies from 1966, which essentially maintains bonded workers on, we could substitute farms for plantations. Why is it? Poverty, racism, economic impoverishment continuing as part of the colonial empire. That is why it continues to happen, without question.
Thank you, Yvonne. Anyone else want to opine on the question? Okay, we have no other audience questions at this moment. So I want to thank everyone. I promised the panelists that there would be a lively discussion and excellent thought-provoking questions from the York Circle audience, and they did not disappoint. So I want to thank so much to everyone for posing their questions. I want to thank our panelists for being here to lead us on this very important discussion. It was an honor for me to be here to host all of you this morning. So I think I will, before I do that, Professor Bawa, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I'm sorry. I did see a question earlier, but I didn't know whether you were going to get to it, and I don't know if I've provided an answer somewhat. And it was somebody who asked whether if $1 a day does not help, then what would help? I don't know if anyone else saw it. So I don't know if you were able to get the question appeared. So anyway, I figured I would answer that in case the person was still listening for an answer. And I think we've covered a lot of that in terms of how these individualized approaches do not work in various ways. For me, it is looking at the whole picture. It is about, so you're supporting this one person. So in other words, you are atomizing this one person, this person is an individual. So even if you were to provide all of the person's needs, that person still lives in a society. That person still lives in a country that is economically, politically marginalized, for instance. So even that dollar on its own, if that person were to get that whole dollar, would not go far enough, because their economy as a whole is also very much dependent on these inequalities in the global system. So you have to ask, these kinds of questions that then say, what is my dollar actually going toward? And should that dollar be going toward that? Or should I actually hold my government and those of other Western governments responsible for continuing to create impoverishment? Right? It's almost like saying, so we save the one worker, as Yvonne just said, the one worker who comes to Canada, we're able to mobilize for this one worker. But then we don't change the policies, we don't change the system. So next year there will be another worker. And if there's nobody else to mobilize, or if people become tired of mobilization, then what happens to that system? We also have to realize that, within this global system, our economy has changed into what we now call the neoliberal economic system, where everything becomes individualized responsibility. You are basically working like the government. You do and take care of everything. And it's the same, that system is exported to other countries. And so, as Yvonne just said, if you have a very poor economic system and people are saying, well, there are jobs there, I don't care how much they're paying me, I just want to earn money for my family, then you sign all kinds of waivers. And it's not only even just for the farm workers, we're also talking about nannies from the Philippines, especially, who come into this country. Any kind of foreign a worker that comes into this country without the protections that we have, they contribute towards our social welfare system, but cannot, take advantage of it, as Yvonne said, in those cases where they are unwell. So I think in a lot of ways, we have to be accountable. Like, we have to hold our government, because it's closer to us. We can see it. We can walk to York University, hopefully, and say, what are you doing, York University, about this problem? As opposed to someone who may not be aware of those systems that are in place, right? A lot of us are walking around systems and we hardly see these kinds of dots that, for instance, Yvonne, a lot of workers don't know anything about the worker rights systems that they have, especially when they are coming from abroad. But anyway, I just wanted to ask that question. Answer that question. I'm a sociologist, so I tend to want to say, let's put everything together. Let's think about it holistically. And if they should tell you there's just that one child who is living alone in a society, you have to ask yourself, how is it that one child is able to actually survive in a society? What about their family? What about their relatives? When they are sick, if the healthcare system is broken, where would they go? Would they be flown to Canada? Things like that. So I think that we really do need to ask those kinds of questions. And to your point also, sorry, quickly, Yvonne, there are people in some of these impoverished countries who are trying or who are asking these questions. We just don't hear them. We don't know that they are asking, that there's great activism about these things, but it's easy to suppress them, for instance, especially in terms of how our news is even covered for us or how the knowledge is produced. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sylvia, do you want to respond as well?
Just a teeny tiny thing.
Please. No.
And it's actually just like I'm following up on Professor Bawa's ideas, like that. The other layer to that is the fact that, like, when we're talking about charity and aid and international development at the moment, we're also talking about an industry, right? And that when we're talking about $1 a day for one child, actually that transaction is supporting employment most of the time within those Western countries, and also supporting contracts within that Western country. So when we're talking about $1, what fraction actually makes it to that child that we're referring to is also another debate. So we need to look into how these things actually function, and what kind of economy they're actually supporting, which that's the only point I wanted to make.
Thank you. Any other comments anybody wanted to make? I don't want to. Thank you, Professor Bawa, for bringing that question in. I think it added to the conversation. If, just checking, sorry. Oh, and I see Professor Bawa has added something in the chat for people to do further reading. If there are no other comments, I will now thank our panelists again for leading this important discussion, and turn it back to Julie Laffer for a few final housekeeping items before we say goodbye. Julie, thank you to you and the alumni engagement team for helping bring another York Circle series to life.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Yvonne, Dr. Bawa, and Dr. Romulus for sharing your knowledge and your research with us today. I really enjoyed today's Q&A. We had some very thoughtful and passionate members of the audience today, and it was great to have some live Q&A as well. And thank you, Rebecca, for leading us through a truly thought-provoking discussion. As always, you put together a really powerful and engaging York Circle series, and we look forward to seeing what you've got in store for us in June. So you can all turn your cameras off now. Thank you once again for being with us this morning. And thanks to you in the audience for taking the time to join us and participate in that great Q&A session. Before we end, we do have another poll for you. How would you rate your knowledge of the topic of today's presentation following the discussion? And that should be appearing now. Please take a moment to respond to that. As a reminder, the theme for the York Circle this year is "O Canada, the True North, Strong and Free." And we'll be back with our final session on Saturday, June 4th. And the topic in June is responsibilities, relations, and respect. 3 Indigenous mothers talk about academia, raising children, and activism. It should be another really interesting one. Registration is currently open, and you can visit the events section on our website, yorku.ca/alumni and friends, to secure your spot. And finally, we're always interested in hearing from you. We've shared a survey link in the chat, and we'd like to ask that you take a moment to fill it out, please. You can make any suggestions you have for future topics, feedback on the survey or through our social media channels, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We look forward to seeing you again in June and hopefully in person. Until then, be well.